Want to picture the Middle Ages? Cue ominous dungeons dripping with chains and sinister, spiky chairs. Popular imagination paints medieval justice as one endless Iron Maiden party, with torture racks spinning faster than an 80s hairband on tour. If all those devices were real, medieval budgets would look like an IKEA shopping spree, Swedish furniture, but with extra spikes. Here's the twist. Many notorious torture devices, the Iron Maiden for instance, weren't medieval at all. They're Victorian inventions, designed to horrify and boost museum ticket sales. Actual medieval justice was less about elaborate gadgets and more about practical punishments. Fines, public shaming, or for the truly serious, maybe a stretch on the rack. Thumbscrews popped up occasionally, but mostly in the juicier court dramas, not your average chicken theft case. So next time you imagine a castle, remember, not every musty corner hid a gadget straight out of a Saw movie. Sometimes torture was just an awkward silence and really bad breath. While medieval torture devices were indeed brutal, the belief that everyone was tortured for minor offenses is another common misconception. Imagine the Middle Ages as one non-stop Game of Thrones marathon, where jaywalking gets you an express ticket to the Iron Maiden. Tempting, right? But let's hit pause on that blood-soaked highlight reel. Popular myths love to dress medieval justice as a 24/7 festival of fire, brimstone, and creatively spiked torture devices. Yet, like most things involving pointy metal and theatrical hand-wringing, these tales owe more to Renaissance fever dreams and Victorian Gothic novelists than to actual history. In truth, whipping out torture gear wasn't the default reaction to every stolen chicken. Medieval legal codes were surprisingly clear about when, how, and why nastiness could be unleashed, which, believe it or not, involved a fair share of paperwork. Think medieval courts less dungeon, more DMV, more robes, definitely worse lighting. The scariest punishment for swiping an onion? A stint in the stocks, or for the real troublemakers, a stern "don't do it again," served up with ecclesiastical flair. Torture? That was saved for high-stakes confessions, not gossiping about the Lord's questionable haircut. And in many regions, even the grumpiest judge couldn't flip the torture switch without backup from fellow justices and a mountain of paperwork that would surprise a society still wrestling with the printing press. If medieval justice tortured everyone for petty crimes, who'd be left to plow the fields or grumble about taxes? So next time you picture the Middle Ages, think more bureaucratic bustle than ironclad boogeymen. Understanding the frequency and targets of torture helps clarify myths surrounding specific devices, such as the Iron Maiden. Picture a torture device so fiendish, even your worst enemy might raise an eyebrow. The legendary Iron Maiden. Supposedly a medieval must-have, this spiked, human-sized metal closet was said to impale poor souls inside for a painfully prickly finale. If that creepy image sends chills down your spine, congratulations. You've just boarded the theme park ride of historical myth. Movies, gloomy museum exhibits, and bone-chilling tales would have you believe Iron Maidens were as common in the Middle Ages as bad wigs at a Renaissance fair. But buckle up, there's not a scrap of genuine medieval evidence, no letters, no sketches, not even a monk's grumpy diary entry. Most Iron Maidens actually hail from the 1700s and 1800s, crafted primarily to dazzle and separate the gullible tourist from their coins. Honestly, finding an authentic medieval Iron Maiden is about as likely as spotting a domesticated dragon, which, on the plus side, would make a great pet. So next time you stumble upon one, remember, the only thing spikier than an Iron Maiden is the hair of the heavy metal band that borrowed its name. Meanwhile, medieval torturers mostly stuck to low-tech scares, think stern glares and whacking sticks, proving you don't need spikes to inspire trembling. Clarifying the origins of torture devices leads us to examine popular beliefs about where such torture supposedly took place, like dungeons. Picture a medieval dungeon, torture devices gleaming, chains clanking, and some poor sap reconsidering a career in shoemaking. We've all seen the movies, stone-walled misery chambers with more suffering than a Monday morning. But hold on to your chastity belts. That image is more Hollywood spiel than historical spiel. The word dungeon originally meant the castle's main tower, not some musty, rat-infested basement of doom. Far from being torture palaces, most castles didn't even bother with a special room dedicated to sadistic hobbies. Court-sanctioned torment was more a public spectacle than a solo gig for a mustache-twirling jailer with a flair for dramatic lighting. Those dungeons were often glorified closets, storerooms, or, my personal favorite, a wine cellar. In reality, they housed more vintage bottles than whimpers. Most torture gadgets on display in castles today? Victorian daydreams, not medieval nightmares. The Middle Ages, more mead, less medieval mad scientist. And those chains you imagined? Probably just to keep thirsty monks from raiding the barrels. So next time you're on a dungeon tour, remember, medieval justice was less about private agony, more about public humiliation, and maybe the occasional wine theft crackdown. Exploring the function of dungeons connects to misconceptions about who endorsed or relished torture, especially the church. Ever been told the medieval church gleefully ran torture chambers straight out of a villain's lair? Well, hang up your Iron Maiden. History's raising a skeptical eyebrow. Popular tales paint monks swapping prayers for thumbscrews, turning crypts into haunted house attractions. Yet the truth is far more, let's say, tightly scripted. Church doctrine, in theory, frowned upon unnecessary cruelty. It was less Torture Tuesdays and more a reluctant, let's talk this out, with a side of fire and brimstone. Sure, torture did sneak into those inquisitions, but wrapped in a web of official rules and about as much oversight as a toddler with a cookie jar. The church much preferred a hot confession over hot irons. Their go-to weapons were penance, fines, and the occasional moral guilt trip. And those grisly torture devices paraded in museums? Thank Victorian showmen, most are about as authentic as a plastic Halloween skeleton. So ditch the image of torture-happy clergy. Most medieval monks spent more time battling bedbugs than heretics. The real villain here? Overzealous storytellers with a flair for the dramatic. Understanding the church's stance on torture sheds light on assumptions about the intent behind medieval torture methods. Picture a dungeon where pain management means dialing agony up to 11, a place so far before medieval HR invented the suggestion box it might as well have been on another planet. We've all watched the movies, the rack groaning, peasants wailing, and somewhere nearby, a jailer cackling with hygiene standards as questionable as his job performance. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, medieval torture's greatest hits, supposedly crafted for maximum flair and minimum mercy. But let's cool the drama. Some notorious instruments, like the Iron Maiden, owe more to heavy metal album covers than actual history. A 19th century showman's fantasy gone viral. Real torture gear? Not nearly as imaginative. Justice was a public spectacle, sure, but often more about sending a message than inventing new ways to make you scream. Surprisingly, torture came with red tape. Protocols! Legalities. Paperwork probably designed to trip up the torturers. Sometimes, a quick execution was called mercy and efficiency. So next time your Monday meeting feels like torture, remember, at least in the dungeon, no one CC'd you on 1,000 memos. Knowing the design and purpose of torture devices informs our perspective on specific groups targeted, such as alleged witches. Imagine being pressured into confessing crimes you didn't commit, only with far fewer lawyers and a lot more firewood. The classic image, witches strapped to medieval torture devices, babbling wild tales of midnight broomstick soirees. Sometimes that stereotype hit the mark. Germany and Scotland practically treated torture like a national pastime, but the reality was sneakier and far less metallic. Most confessions came well before any thumbscrews made an appearance. Endless questioning, sleepless nights, and villages whipped into a hysterical frenzy did the heavy lifting. Honestly, some poor souls probably confessed just to dodge another round of suspicious neighbor potluck invites. In England, where torture was technically off limits, interrogators got crafty, trapping suspects in mind-bending logic puzzles and keeping them awake until reality blurred into hallucinations. European laws were a real mixed bag. Some regions practically handed out boiling oil as party favors, while others acted shocked at even the hint of torture. Truth be told, psychological torment did more damage than any Iron Maiden ever could. If mental stress counted, every awkward family reunion would be facing indictment at The Hague. Examining the use of torture on witches helps analyze the prevalence of instruments like the rack across medieval society. Imagine a medieval torture device moonlighting as a motivational poster. Stretch your limits. But before you picture the rack gathering dust in some villain's lair, let's squash the myth. This wasn't an exclusive gadget for mustache-twirling baddies. Nope, the rack was basically the medieval chiropractor nobody asked for, common as bad dental work across Europe. Far from a theatrical oddity, the rack was the Apple gadget of its day in England, Spain, and France during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Its main feature? Encouraging confessions by turning suspects into human taffy. This wasn't a hush-hush tool either. Courts considered it a perfectly legit means to dispense justice, not just villainous flair. Even celebs like Guy Fawkes got their 15 minutes, stretched out on the rack. Public accusation? Private grudge? The rack was always game. Medieval legal advice: lawyer up, but maybe also invest in some rope-resistant joints. Being short? Suddenly, a blessing in disguise. So next time you hear "stretch your limits," be glad it's not quite so literal. The widespread presence of the rack leads to questions about the legality and regulation of torture during that period. Think the Middle Ages were just one long, grim episode of Game of Thrones, where every judge moonlighted as a thumbscrew enthusiast? Think again. While Hollywood loves to sell medieval courtrooms as haunted dungeons run by sadists, reality checks in with a lot less melodrama and significantly fewer dislocated shoulders. Pop culture treats the era like a torture-themed amusement park, but in truth, medieval justice was more about paperwork than pyrotechnics. Torture wasn't the default setting. It was tightly regulated, often illegal, and sometimes met with the medieval equivalent of a bureaucratic sigh. Early courts preferred ordeals. Picture this. Instead of a 10-step torture montage, you just had to plunk your hand on a hot iron. Charming, right? It wasn't until the Inquisition and the Renaissance that torture got its express lane. But don't imagine you could get roughed up for petty theft. No freelance torturers hawking their services with punch cards or snappy business cards here. Official permission was absolutely required. By the time poor John Doe was sweating it out, many countries were already revisiting their torture policies, with medieval lawyers busily defending nothing less than loopholes and rack maintenance manuals. Understanding the legal framework around torture impacts the credibility of stories about particular devices, such as the pear of anguish. Ever heard of the pear of anguish and wondered which medieval sadist said, "You know what this torture rack needs? A kitchen gadget." This notorious pear-shaped contraption supposedly solved the age-old problem of not enough things expanding inside your enemies. Legend has it, it was inserted. Pick your nightmare. Mouth, rectum, or worse, then cranked wide open, leaving victims begging for a time machine to skip the whole mess. But before you imagine inquisitors running a medieval Bed Bath & Beyond, here's the twist. Most tales about this dreadful fruit bomb popped up centuries after the Middle Ages. Historical fan fiction with extra trauma. The surviving peers are more brass tchotchkes than instruments of agony. Small, decorative, and about as threatening as a souvenir spoon. Historians suspect these were curiosities, fakes, or maybe even trophies, not the go-to gear for torturers. There's zero solid proof they were standard medieval issue. Don't worry, though. Our ancestors were still masters of misery, just without the fruity flair. Whether genuine or mythical, these devices contribute to ideas about the public spectacle associated with torture. Forget Netflix. Medieval crowds got front-row seats to grisly live drama. That's right. Bored townsfolk didn't endlessly scroll for thrills. They packed the square, hoping their neighbor was today's headliner. The myth? Torture and execution were hushed, shadowy affairs whispered about in taverns. The reality? These were major public spectacles, somewhere between civic duty and a medieval Coachella. If your main act was a guy getting dunked in a muddy pond. Authorities knew the spectacle wasn't just punishment. It was a lesson served with extra, shall we say, punch. From the stocks, think low-tech timeout, to the far more excruciating wheel, every event sent a crystal-clear message: behave, or you're next. Vendors hawked pies as local jesters heckled the condemned. Early influencers didn't post selfies. They just prayed they wouldn't be the next headliner. So next time you grumble about dull town festivals, be glad the highlight isn't a live torture show. Suddenly, a three-legged race sounds downright thrilling by comparison. The popularity of public torture raises questions about the rights and protections, or lack thereof, afforded to victims. Imagine being wronged, and your only legal recourse is yelling into a void, and the void sends you a bill for emotional labor. That's basically how justice looked for most people throughout history, unless you were born wearing a toga and clutching a trust fund. There's a stubborn myth that victims in the past were always powerless, stripped of legal rights, mere sad spectators at the world's longest injustice parade. The reality? Messier and creatively unfair. Take ancient Rome. The rich could sometimes lawyer or just grease palms to snag a verdict. Everyone else needed a miracle and a wealthy friend, preferably both. In medieval Europe, unless you outranked your landlord, your complaint might as well have been written in disappearing ink. Hammurabi's code was full of rules, sure, but justice was a sliding scale, and if you were low status, you were basically a legal afterthought. Women and children? They usually ranked somewhere below the family goat, but just above the ottoman. By the Enlightenment, people started chatting about rights for everyone, but for actual equality, you'd have to wait a few more centuries. The most reliable verdict for a peasant? A lord's guaranteed eye roll, and maybe a polite suggestion to relocate. Far, far away. Consideration of victims' rights also frames how medieval Europe's reputation as a center of torture is often portrayed. If you think your neighbor's lawn flamingos are a form of torture, try surviving medieval Europe. The Middle Ages get a bad rap as one endless, spiky festival of sadism, where your average peasant couldn't just nip out for bread without risking a spin in the Iron Maiden or a quick shuffle on the rack. Popular culture loves to credit medieval folks with inventing a bespoke torture device for every limb, digit, and questionable dance move. But here's the twist. Even the infamous Iron Maiden is more Victorian fever dream than medieval reality, likely dreamed up in a museum curator's over-caffeinated nightmare. Thumbscrews and other horrors? Many are pure fiction, concocted centuries later to horrify theater crowds, not heretics. Yes, torture did happen, but it was regulated, relatively rare, and mostly reserved for serious offenses, or at least suspects with really terrible alibis. The real medieval agony? Surviving January without central heating or indoor plumbing. Honestly, forget Iron Maidens. Trying to explain feudal taxes to a peasant was punishment enough. So maybe cut your neighbor's spooky lawn decor some slack, and cut them some slack too. Popular images of medieval torture culture often include how torturers were characterized as masked and brutal figures. Picture a dungeon. A hulking figure with a sack over his face, a rusty axe glinting menacingly in one meaty paw, scowling like he's headlining a 1387 reboot of Friday the 13th. Meet the executioner of your nightmares, or at least every lousy horror flick's version of him. The popular myth? All medieval torturers looked like they just stepped off a slasher movie set, masks and all. But let's inject some reality into the horror show. Masks? Sure, sometimes, but mostly during public executions, when dodging angry mobs or avoiding blood in your beard was a serious concern. As for torture itself, most practitioners were surprisingly bureaucratic, the medieval equivalent of a middle manager, armed with a stack of paperwork and a bad attitude instead of an axe. Torture was a civic duty. Less chains and thunderclaps, more, please fill out this ledger before the stretching. Pop culture loves the masked monster myth. The truth? These folks looked alarmingly like your local accountant. Awkward, pale, and definitely not rocking a hockey mask. Because honestly, nothing's scarier than a torturer with an Excel spreadsheet. This characterization influences beliefs about the validity and acceptance of confessions extracted through torture. Imagine sweating it out in a medieval dungeon, faced with a torturer waving around an alarming array of finger-crushing gadgets. Would you heroically stick to the truth, or just blurt out the location of Atlantis to catch an early exit? If you thought your last job interview was stressful, be grateful it didn't involve hot pokers. The stubborn myth says medieval officials eagerly swallowed every confession wrung from the rack, nodding wisely as you fessed up to wizardry or inventing square wheels. In reality, torture was less a truth serum and more an unreliable fiction machine. Judges and inquisitors, shockingly, viewed those pain-fueled tales with healthy skepticism. Torture wasn't the opening act in the medieval whodunit. It usually only made a cameo after other evidence stacked up. No shortcuts here. And just in case your first coerced confession was a tall tale, they'd often make you repeat it, over and over. For centuries, Legal minds and church officials debated the value of these confessions, usually concluding they were about as dependable as a weather forecast. In the end, those forced confessions got scrutinized so intensely they'd make modern lawyers look impulsive, proving the only thing reliably produced under torture was an Oscar-worthy performance. Finally, perceptions about confession under torture relate to the misconception that torture practices ceased entirely after the Middle Ages. Think torture ended when knights swapped armor for tights? Think again. Popular legend waves it goodbye with the Middle Ages, alongside dragons and the myth of clean public restrooms. Blame Hollywood. Nothing screams sinister like a smoke-filled dungeon and a monarch with the moral backbone of soggy cardboard. But in reality, torture didn't retire. It got promoted to a cushy desk job. Historical records show interrogation with added enthusiasm thrived well into the Renaissance. The Spanish Inquisition, for instance, didn't peak in the Dark Ages. They were happily updating their torture manuals like it was a bestseller. And no, the guillotine wasn't designed for slicing baguettes. Sure, Enlightenment philosophers ranted about human dignity, but the memos apparently got lost, maybe tucked away next to the first indoor plumbing blueprints. France only officially dumped torture in 1789, while other countries clung to the toolbox even longer. So while knights hung up their swords, European judges dusted off brand-new torture handbooks. Apparently, the real medieval relic isn't a rusty helmet. It's legal torture, sticking around long enough to see powdered wigs come into fashion.